Professor Russell Botman, Rector and Vice Chancellor, Stellenbosch University, Deans of various departments and colleges of the university, distinguished guests, students of the university, ladies and gentlemen. Since this is my first visit to Stellenbosch University, let me say from the outset that this is a world-class university, and I am happy to be here. I should like to take this opportunity to thank Professor Botman for inviting me to deliver a public lecture on the theme of Africa's hope for security and development in the 21st century. I am confident that the optimal use of the resources and facilities at this university and the newly established Security Institute for Governance and Leadership in Africa, SIGLA, will greatly contribute to the making of the 21st century to be Africa's century. It is a supreme irony that despite the existence of excellent institutions of higher learning, such as Stellenbosch University and many others within Africa, coupled with its abundance of natural resources, the continent remains poor and marginalized. Before I start elaborating on the statement I have just made, allow me to apologize profusely for having to postpone the lecture which was originally planned for July the 3rd, 2012. In this regard, I should like to thank the management of the university for accepting my request to defer the lecture until today. I am therefore pleased to be able to visit the university today and deliver the lecture. Let me now turn to my reflections on the theme, Africa's Hope for Security and Development in the 21st Century. In my view, there is no doubt that Africa and its leaders consider security and development as the priority agenda for the continent at national, sub-regional, and regional levels. It is also my considered view that the pursuit of the security and development agenda has had a major influence in changing the political and economic landscape in Africa. Three contemporary trends are discernible from Africa's security and development agenda. The first trend is the end of boundary disputes that impacted negatively on Africa's development efforts in the post-independence era. This period may also be characterized as the period of interstate conflicts in Africa, but it is now best left to history and historians. The second trend relates to the period of military coups d'etat in Africa and the preponderance of intrastate conflicts or conflicts within states. This was also the period of one-party states without any rotation in leadership. Life presidency was a common phenomenon during this period, which has also ended. The third trend is characterized by the emergence of multi-party systems of democracy and the introduction of limited terms of presidential office. I refer this period as the period of further democratization of the continent and the consolidation of peace and security as the prerequisite for social and economic development and transformation. It is indeed the period that must be associated with Africa's hope for security and development in the 21st century. Chairperson, senior officials of the university, students, invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, I should like to suggest that it is on the basis of the changing political and economic landscape in Africa that we can explore Africa's hope for security and development in the 21st century. In this context, African leaders have always recognized the intrinsic link between security and development. It was precisely within this understanding that on the 11th July 1990, the Assembly of Heads of State and Government of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, the organization that preceded the establishment of the African Union, AU, adopted the Declaration on the Political and Socio-Economic Situation in Africa and the fundamental changes taking place in the world. The 1990 Declaration was adopted following a critical review of the political, social, and economic situation of the continent in the light of the rapid changes that were taking place in the world and their impact on Africa. This was at the end of the Cold War, with the major changes taking place in East-West relations. The 1990 Declaration provided the opportunity and framework for serious discussion on the security development nexus in Africa. In fact, in adopting the declaration, African leaders were fully aware that in order to facilitate the process of Africa's socio-economic transformation and integration, it was necessary to promote democracy and popular participation of the people in the processes of government and development. In their view, a political environment which guarantees human rights and the observance of the rule of law would assure a high standard of probity and accountability on the part of those who hold public office. In addition, popular-based political processes would ensure the involvement of all, including in particular women and youth, in the development efforts. This led to the elaboration of the African Charter for Popular Participation in Development and Transformation, adopted in Arusha, Tanzania, on 16th February 1990. I should like to emphasize that in the 1990 Declaration on Fundamental Changes, the leaders committed themselves to the further democratization of societies and to the consolidation of democratic institutions in their respective countries. However, the leaders reaffirmed the right of their countries to determine in all sovereignty their system of democracy on the basis of their socio-economic values, while taking into account the realities of each country and the necessity to ensure development and safety, the basic needs of the people, and to satisfy the basic needs of the people. To this end, they asserted that security, democracy, and development should go together and should be mutually reinforcing. I would like to submit that it was in recognition of the security development nexus that the 1990 Declaration warned that the possibility of achieving sustainable development would be constrained as long as an atmosphere of lasting peace and stability did not prevail in Africa. With this understanding, African leaders therefore renewed their determination to work together towards the peaceful and speedy resolution of all conflicts on the continent. It was their considered view that the resolution of said conflicts would be conducive to the creation of peace and security on the continent. It would also have the effect of reducing expenditure on defense and security, thus realizing additional resources for socio-economic development. It was also within this understanding that on the 29th June 1993, the heads of state and government of OAU adopted a declaration on establishing a mechanism for conflict prevention, management, and resolution in Cairo. Distinguished guests, faculty members, students, ladies and gentlemen, I have spent some time highlighting Africa's appreciation and understanding of the security development nexus. I have consistently stated the obvious by making the argument that there is an intrinsic link between security and development. I know there are those who would argue that there is no necessary correlation between security and development. Let me state here categorically that after the protracted war of destabilization in Mozambique, we have a very clear appreciation of the place of peace and security in development. The war of destabilization in Mozambique, besides killing around 1 million people, placed a lot of pressure on the economy and reduced the capacity of the government to effectively address the basic needs of the people. There were about 1.7 million refugees in the neighboring countries, Malawi, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Tanzania, and Swaziland, and some in South Africa, and about 4.5 million internally displaced. This situation has required the undertaking of a strong mobilization of external and internal resources in order to care for their food, shelter, clothing, and health care, as well as education for their children. It destroyed the country's economic infrastructure and other basic facilities. The killing, abduction, and displacement of people have torn apart the social tissue of the country. The destruction amounted to about $7 billion US. The cost of post-conflict reconstruction was extremely high. Against this background, and in order to bring further clarity to the nexus between security and development, let me suggest that from the various experiences of sources of conflict in Africa, the concept of security must be given a broader definition. Significantly, security should be redefined to encompass not merely the security of the state, but also the security of its people. In this regard, it is important to define security concerns much more broadly than merely the threat of violence, to include economic and social concerns such as welfare, comprising access to land, employment, social services, namely education, health, and equitable distribution of national wealth. The definition should also encompass the broader and non-military nature of security concerns, including human rights, good governance, and access to education and health care, and ensuring that each individual has opportunities and choices to fulfill his or her own potential. Every step in this direction is also a step towards reducing poverty, achieving economic growth, and preventing conflict. From the experiences of the Arab Spring, which started in 2010, and the ongoing events in Côte d'Ivoire, Mali, Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, Guinea-Bissau, and Syria, it is abundantly clear that in order to avoid the recurrence of conflicts and to prepare for sustainable development, governments are increasingly required to demonstrate their commitment to democratic governance, transparency, accountability, poverty reduction, and equal distribution of their wealth, of their nation's wealth, with a view to avoiding the marginalization of some sections of the society. These are essentially parameters of the broader definition of security. To this end, it is also generally agreed that it is necessary for the development policies to emphasize the need for reducing conflict and improving governance, investing in people, increasing competitiveness and diversification, improving aid effectiveness, and reducing Africa's dependence on aid. In my view, this defines the security development nexus. This is critical in the process to sustain Africa's hope for security and development in the 21st century. At this juncture, I would like to suggest that Africa has put in place sufficient mechanisms and measures to promote peace and security on the continent. Based on the experiences within the continent, Africa has moved away from the traditional definition of security as the protection of the territorial integrity, stability, and vital interests of states through the use of political, legal, or coercive instrument at the state of international level. Within the continent, it is now clear that security includes non-military threats that lead to violent conflicts and affect the security of individuals, communities, and states. Such threats range from popular discontent expressed in mass demonstrations, civil wars, and resource conflicts to transnational crime and population movements. Security, therefore, refers to the search to avoid, prevent, reduce, or resolve violent conflicts, whether the threat originates from other states, non-state actors, or structural social economic conditions. On this basis, I would also like to suggest that Africa has the potential of addressing its security concerns and building the necessary environment for faster growth and development in the 21st century. Distinguished guests, faculty members, students, ladies and gentlemen, I should like to turn my reflection to the prospects for Africa's development. For me, it is encouraging to note that the World Bank has recently indicated that the economy of sub-Saharan Africa grew faster than both Brazil and India during the first decade of this century, and will continue to grow faster than Brazil's during the first half of the second decade of the 21st century. According to the World Bank, given the need for fiscal retrenchment in industrial countries of the world, African countries can benefit from the rebalancing of economies and serve as a new source of global demand. According to the World Bank, many African countries have made important economic reforms, improving their macroeconomic management, liberalizing markets and trade, and widening the space for private sector activities. Another positive sign for Africa's hope for security and development in the 21st century is that currently several African countries tend to be listed among the world's frontier emerging markets. They include Botswana, Cape Verde, Ghana, Kenya, Mauritius, Mozambique, Namibia, Nigeria, Seychelles, South Africa, Tanzania, Uganda, and Zambia. The Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, estimates that the land area for rain-fed crops could be increased from 150% to 700% per region, with a potential increase for the whole continent of 300 million hectares. Africa has a 60% share of the world's total amount of uncultivated arable land, and with its enormous potential for agriculture, has attracted large investments. It is estimated that up to 50 million hectares of African farmland has been acquired by foreign investors. The continent is experiencing what is commonly referred to as the second scramble for Africa. Access to Africa's mineral and agriculture is becoming increasingly essential for Europe, North America, and Asia. A report by McKinsey Global Institute entitled Lions on the Move, the progress and potential of African economies suggests that many of the 54 African economies face serious challenges, including poverty, disease, and high infant mortality. Yet Africa's collective GDP at US 1.6 trillion in 2008 is now roughly equal to Brazil and Russia's, and the continent is among the world's most rapidly growing regions. The report also suggests that Africa's growth acceleration resulted from more than a resource boom. According to the report, it was also the result of government action to end political conflicts, improve macroeconomic conditions, and create a better business climate, which enabled growth to accelerate broadly across countries and sectors. There is no doubt that the key reasons behind Africa's growth surge were improved political and macroeconomic as well as macroeconomic reforms thrive. It has been correctly suggested that the end of conflict in most African countries created the political stability necessary to foster economic growth. I share the view that Africa's economies grew healthier as governments lowered their inflation, trimmed their foreign debt, and shrunk their budget deficit. Finally, the African governments adopted policies to energize markets. They privatized the state-owned companies, reduced trade barriers, cut corporate taxes, and strengthened regulatory and legal frameworks. These actions, in my view, also created a better investment climate in Africa. There is general agreement that Africa will continue to profit from rising global demand for oil, natural gas, minerals, food, and other natural resources. Africa's resource endowment includes 10% of the world's oil reserve, 40% of its gold, and 80 to 90% of the chromium and platinum group metals. Although the platinum now is passing a period of crisis, it is possible that the demand for raw materials is growing fastest in the world emerging economies. The report prepared by the McKinsey's Global Institute presents interesting statistics on Africa's future development trajectory. The report suggests that Africa's collective GDP in 2008 was 1.6 trillion, roughly equal to Brazil and Russia's. In 2020, Africa's collective GDP is estimated to be 2.6 trillion. Africa's combined consumer spending in 2008 was 860 billion, but by 2020 it will rise to 1.4 trillion. According to McKinsey report, 316 million new mobile phone subscribers have signed up in Africa since 2000. Africa has 52 cities with more than 1 million people each. Significantly, there are 20 African companies with revenue of at least $3 billion, while the number of people of working age in 2040 will be 1.1 billion. In 2020, the number of African households with discretionary income will reach 128 million, and the proportion of Africans living in cities in 2030 will be 50%. These statistics most certainly provide a source of encouragement for Africa's hope for security and development in the 21st century. Africa represents a huge market for the world economies. Distinguished guests, faculty members, students, ladies and gentlemen. In conclusion, throughout the presentation, I have sought to argue that Africa has over the decades deployed efforts to address issues of peace and security as a precondition for social and economic development. Significant progress has been made in addressing the security concerns of the continent and in creating a secure and stable environment for social and economic development. There has been a better appreciation of the nexus between security and development. This is essentially because the costs and the consequences of violence, conflict, and insecurity on development outcomes have become apparent. At the same time, African leaders have put in place mechanisms and measures to address the scourge of conflicts and to mitigate their devastating effects on countries, economies, and infrastructure. Africa has developed a better understanding of the correlation between low levels of economic development and propensity for conflict. There is no doubt that poor economic performance and social disparities often become major sources of conflict. In most cases, the countries that are at the bottom of the Human Development Index also tend to be those countries that face persistent violence, conflict, and human security challenges. Poverty is the major source of insecurity in Africa. It is precisely for this reason that Africa must deploy great efforts to meet the Millennium Development Goals. There is therefore an imperative need to ensure that development policies are also designed to address basic human security issues. Africa has already adopted specific mechanisms and measures to advance the cause of larger freedom by ensuring freedom from want, freedom from fear, and freedom to live in dignity. There is a greater realization within the continent that in any increasingly interconnected world, progress in the areas of development, security, and human rights must go hand in hand. Here a small bracket here to call your attention to the question of why there was this crisis and this conflict in Libya, where people were well fed, nobody had lack of food, people had education, had health, they had everything socially. The fuel there was very cheap. It was almost for nothing. You put your gas in your car and you drive. But still there was a crisis. The reason why? Because there was this lack of this balance. There was this balance. Human rights, the participation of the people, and the whole process of decision-making, all other freedoms which were not felt there. So there must be a balance. The 1990 Declaration clearly spells out that there will be no development without security and no security without development. There is no doubt that both development and security also depend on respect for human rights and the rule of law. Africa recognizes that in order to sustain the required levels of economic performance and growth, there is an imperative need to consolidate democracy and to promote popular participation in development. Against this background, the member states of the African Union adopted the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance on 30th January 2007. In adopting the Charter, the African leaders were inspired by the objectives and principles enshrined in the 2002 Constitutive Act of the African Union, particularly Articles 3 and 4, which emphasize the significance of good governance, popular participation, the rule of law, and human rights. Additionally, the leaders were guided by their common mission to strengthen and consolidate institutions for good governance, continental unity, and solidarity. They made a commitment to promote the universal values and principles of democracy, good governance, human rights, and the right to development. These are essential measures as they provide the enabling environment for security and development, and therefore the basis for Africa's hope for security and development in 2001 century. I'm sorry, in development in the 21st century. Africa recognized that security, democracy, and leadership are essential for Africa's development. The African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance was expected to enhance the relevant declarations and decisions of the AU, aimed at promoting peace and security as a condition for social and economic development. The Charter included the 1990 Declaration on the Political and Socio-Economic Situation in Africa and the fundamental changes taking place in the world, and the Cairo Agenda for the relaunch of Africa's economic and social development. Other declarations included the 1999 Algiers Declaration on unconstitutional changes of government, the 2000 Lomé Declaration on the framework for an OAU response to unconstitutional changes of government, the 2002 OAU Declaration, OAU-AU Declaration on Principles Governing Democratic Elections in Africa, and the 2003 Protocol relating to the establishment of the Peace and Security Council of the African Union. I would like to emphasize that these declarations constitute a major source of inspiration for Africa's hope for security and development in the 21st century. In my view, there is no doubt that Africa is well prepared to make full use of the global opportunities available in the 21st century. Africa's strategic importance in the world will remain high given its level of resource endowment and the corresponding global demand for mineral resources. It is important to note that even though the global economic crisis crippled economies across the planet and even caused a dip in commodity prices and timidly in investment that slowed African economic growth, the continent has survived with bright prospects for the way forward. I wish to reiterate that it has been generally acknowledged that in terms of its economy, sub-Saharan Africa grew faster than both Brazil and India during the first decade of this century and will continue to grow faster than Brazil during the first half of the second decade of 21st century. I should like to conclude by stating categorically that this trend provides a very firm basis for Africa's hope for security and development in the 21st century. Thank you very much.